Number 1. Metaphors, also known as direct comparisons, are one of the most common literary devices. A metaphor is a statement in which two objects, often unrelated, are compared to each other. For example, this tree is the god of the forest. Obviously, the tree is not a god. It is in fact a tree. Metaphors allow the writer to pack multiple descriptions and images into one short sentence. The metaphor has much more weight and value than a direct description. Next one is the simile, also known as indirect comparison, similar in construction of metaphor. But for example, this tree is like the god of the forest, or this tree acts the god of the forest. So what is the difference between the two? The most common difference between the two is the simile uses like or us, whereas metaphor never uses these comparison words. Next one is imagery. Imagery can be both literal and figurative. It relies on the interplay of language and sensation to create the sharper image in your brain. Imagery is what it sounds like, the use of figurative language to describe something. In fact, we have already seen imagery in action through the previous literary devices. By describing the tree as a god, the tree looks large and sturdy. So first is the sight imagery. The tree spread its gigantic, sun-flecked shoulders. Sound imagery, on the other hand, is the forest was hushed, resounding with echoes of the tree's stoic silence. Next is the touch imagery. The tree felt smooth. Taste imagery, the tree's leaves tasted bitter. Smell imagery, as we approach the tree, the air around. Symbolism combines a lot of the ideas presented in metaphor and imagery. A symbol is the use of an object to represent a concept. It's kind of like a metaphor, except more concise. Symbols are everywhere in the English language. Like peace, represented by a white dove, love, represented by a red rose, conformity, represented by a ship, idea, represented by a light bulb switching on. Next is the personification. Giving human attributes to non-human objects is a powerful way to foster empathy in your readers. Personification is exactly what it sounds like. Think about personification as if it is a specific type of imagery. You can describe a non-human object through the 5 senses, and do so by giving it human descriptions. You can even impute thoughts and emotions. Personification using sight, the car ran a marathon down the highway. If it is using sound, the car coughed, hacked, and spluttered. Using touch, the car was smooth as a baby's bottom. Using taste, the car tastes the bitter asphalt. Hyperbole. You know that one friend who describes things very dramatically. They are probably speaking in hyperboles. Hyperbole is just a dramatic word for being over dramatic. Sounds a little hyperbolic, don't you think? Basically, hyperbole refers to any sort of exaggerated description of a statement. We use hyperbole all the time in English language, and you've probably heard someone say things like, "I've been waiting a billion years for this. See? I'm so hungry, I could eat a horse. I feel like $1,000,000. You are the king of the kitchen." See those exaggerating words like billion years, he can eat a horse, or $1,000,000. So he's the king of the kitchen, which is you are really a good cook. So none of these examples should be interpreted literally. There are no kings in the kitchen, and I doubt anyone can eat an entire horse in one sitting. This common literary device allows us to compare our emotions to something extreme, giving the reader a sense of how intensely we feel something in the moment. This is what makes hyperbole so fun. Coming up with a crazy, exaggerated statements that convey the intensity of the speaker's emotions. So, next is the irony. Irony is a literary device. In literature, irony can describe dialogue. Next is juxtaposition. Refers to the placement of contrasting ideas next to each other, often to produce an ironic or thought-provoking effect. Writers use the juxtaposition in both poetry and prose, though this common literary device looks slightly different within each realm of literature. So in poetry, juxtaposition is used to build tension or highlight an important contrast. So just a note, these juxtapositions are also examples of antithesis, which is when the writer juxtaposes two completely opposite ideas. So juxtaposition doesn't have to be completely contrarian, but in this poem, it is. Juxtaposition accomplishes something similar in prose. A famous example comes from the opening, A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. It was the best of times. It was the worst of time. Dickens opened his novel by switching his characters. Allusion. If you haven't noticed, literary devices are often just fancy words for a simple concept. A metaphor is literally a comparison, and hyperbole is just an over-exaggeration. Allusion is just a fancy word for a literary reference. They are either directly or indirectly referring to another commonly known piece of art or literature. So the most frequently alluded to work is probably the Bible. Many colloquial phrases and ideas stem from it. Since many themes and images from the Bible represents themselves in popular works and Western culture. So any of the following ideas, for example, are biblical allusions. Referring to a kind of stranger as a good Samaritan, describing an ideal place as Edenic or the Garden of Eden. Saying someone turned the other cheek when they were passive in the face of adversity. So when something is described as lasting 40 days and 40 nights, in reference to the flood of Noah's Ark. Of course, allusion literary devices aren't just biblical. You might describe a woman as being as beautiful as the Mona Lisa, or you might call a man as stoic as Hemingway. Why write allusions? So allusions appeal to common experiences. Allegory. An allegory, for example, is George Orwell's Animal Farm is an allegory. And however, allegories are not always allusions. Considers Plato's allegory of the cave, which represents the idea of enlightenment. By representing a complex idea, this allegory could actually be closer to an extended symbol rather than an extended allusion. That's all. I hope you learned a lot. Thank you so much for listening.